Welcome to our AIB webinar series featuring latest research from the Academy's two leading journals, Journal of International Business Studies and Journal of International Business Policy. My name is Minbaeva, and I'm a professor at the King's Business School in King's College London, and I'll be your host today. Our webinars aim at providing a forum for sharing most recent research published and forthcoming in our flagship journals, and of course discussing implications. So it's very future-oriented and future research-focused webinars. I would like to, at this moment, thank the co-organizers for this webinar series, Professor Klaus Meyer from AIB Business School. He will be joining us at the end of this webinar to announce the forthcoming webinars. Also, a big thank you to logistics support from the AIB Secretariat and the tech support from Digital Motion. Very welcome to you, all the participants. You can actively participate in the discussion by posting your questions through Q&A function that you see at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. You should also see the chat, and feel free to use it. However, if you'd like to pose specific questions to the panelists, please do post it in Q&A section. I will pick the question from Q&A section and address it to the panelists. The chat we'll use for the discussion, for the sharing of information, comments, and other things. I would also pick up some of the questions from the chat, should there be something that would be interesting for all of us to reflect upon. So please use the opportunities, either again through the Q&A function or chat. Please engage, and we look very much forward to hearing from you, especially when we have such an exciting topic, informal institutions. Today, we highlight several papers from the most recent special issue of Journal of International Business Studies on informal institutions. And with us today, one of the guest editors, Professor Louis Dow. Louis, would you introduce the special issue as well as the speakers? Over to you.
Thank you, Dana. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to introduce the JIB special issue on informal institutions and international business. I especially want to thank Dana, Klaus, and everyone at AIB for organizing this webinar. It wouldn't happen without their really hard work, and I'm very, very grateful to them. Today we are highlighting 3 papers from the special issue, but I encourage you to review the other papers in the special issue as well. I'm going to copy the link to the special issue here in the chat, so you can go take a look. So I'm sending it to Nicole, and she will send it to everybody else. Some of the authors of the other papers are here in the audience beyond those 3 that are being presented. So please feel free to have a discussion with them and ask them questions. I mean, you can use the chat. And so if you want to discuss anything with them, please go ahead. Our goal today is to get you excited about the importance of studying informal institutions in our field, and to encourage more people to do research in this underexplored area. So if even 1 or 2 of you do that, then this will be a huge success. Okay. So trying to switch slides 1 second. There you go. So here's a list of the 3 papers we're presenting today. So the first one is the editorial to the special issue. It's entitled Informal Institutions and International Business Toward an Integrative Research Agenda. The second one, the impact of informal institutions on the prevalence, strategy, and performance of family firms, a meta-analysis. The third one, the impact of multinational enterprises on community, informal institutions, and rural poverty. The co-moderators are Dana and myself. So the webinar is designed to be as interactive as possible. So each presentation is only 10 minutes long, leaving plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So please participate, ask us your questions, tell us what you think. We really want to learn from you, and we want to have more of a conversation. So I'm going to start with my paper, which is co-authored with Aya Shakar, Marjorie Lyles, and JT Lee. They were my co-editors for the special issue. And I want to thank my co-authors, my co-editors. They have been wonderful, wonderful to work with. So again, this is entitled Informal Institutions and International Business Toward an Integrative Research Agenda. I'm going to start with the motivation for the special issue, not just for this paper, the main concepts and definitions, the main institutional traditions and role of informal institutions in each, which is something that we delve into, and a summary of the special issue papers, and then briefly areas for future research. So in terms of motivation, informal institutions influence all aspects of international business, but they have received limited attention in the literature relative to formal institutions. Why is that, right? And how do we know? Well, before starting this work on the special issue, we ran a search for all articles with the term institutions in the title, and that gave us 50 results, right? Of course, this isn't comprehensive. It's not including keywords and abstract and everything, but gave us a good sense. Then we ran the same thing, but for the term informal institutions, and we got one result before the special issue, that is. Because for the special issue, we got over 70 submissions, of which several made it to the special issue, and the ones that didn't, many were submitted to other journals, and we're seeing them published across the ecosystem of international business journals. We're seeing more and more work on informal institutions that is being inspired by all of that work. So our goal is actually being fulfilled, which is to encourage more work on informal institutions in IB. So we're very pleased about this. But it's unfortunate that there hasn't been more work on informal institutions, because they can be just as meaningful for IB as their formal counterparts. Think about it. Studying only formal institutions provides an incomplete picture of a particular context, which can lead to inaccurate findings and conclusions. If you're only looking at the written rules and are missing the unwritten rules that help you understand a particular setting, then how do we really understand international business there? How do we know that our findings are complete? Likely reasons for why this is happening. Informal institutions are very challenging to capture, theoretically and empirically, relative to the formal ones, right? How do you measure them? It's much harder. But this is not a valid reason not to study them. Are we up to the challenge as a field? So, I mean, most of you know these definitions, but just briefly, institutions are the shared and established rules of the game in a society, the humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interaction, right? They are the rules of the game in a society. Formal institutions are the written rules, like laws, regulations, policies, contracts, things like that. Informal institutions are the unwritten rules or constraints that create social expectations for behavior. They include shared norms of behavior, traditions, customs, reward structures, sanctions, societal expectations that are often taken for granted. An example would be tipping, for example, in different countries, right? Tipping is an unwritten rule. It's typically not something that's codified into law in most countries. For example, I'm from Mexico originally. In Mexico, you're expected to tip about 10%. In the US, it's about 15%. Now it's become closer to 18%. So a Mexican comes to the US, they tip 10%. A very unhappy waiter looks at them funny. It's like, what's wrong with this person, right? And vice versa. In some countries, the expectation is zero for a tip. And if you do tip, it's only for exceptional service. And when Americans come to that country, waiters don't tell them. So they give them an 18% tip, and they're very happy because they get a tip that they weren't expecting, right? This is a very basic example, but imagine contracts, right? To what extent are relationships based on something like handshakes instead of contracts, something really meaningful in a society? Relationships based on mutual expectations of cooperation, right? To what extent are all of these things critical for business? Informal institutions, you can see in each of these papers, are truly critical for IB. There's a lot of terms that are important to disambiguate from institutions, but two that are critical are organizations and culture. Organizations, in common parlance, and in some research, the term institutions is often used to refer to well-established organizations. We often hear this in the media, right? Talking about governments or non-governmental organizations, right? NATO, things like that, right? But as North says, and this is a quote, what must be clearly differentiated are the rules, the institutions, from the players, the organizations or the entrepreneurs or other economic actors, right? Organizations are groups of individuals bound by some common purpose to achieve objectives. That's also from North. Both what organizations come into existence and how they evolve are fundamentally influenced by the institutional framework. In turn, they influence how the institutional framework evolves. So whatever you want to call them, it's important to differentiate them. So we encourage using institutions and organizations because that's what the literature has done. For instance, NATO is an organization that provides a formal institutional framework of written rules to which its member countries agree. Simultaneously, membership in NATO creates informal or unwritten institutional norms and structures between member nations, such as reciprocity and interdependency expectations. The other one is disambiguating between informal institutions and culture. In the paper, we go much more in depth, obviously, but much prior work in IB and other fields has treated these two synonymously. So that is either theoretically the two terms are used interchangeably, measures of culture are used to capture informal institutions, or both. And we make it clear in the paper we are not criticizing this literature. It is a very valuable literature. What we are saying is that much of this valuable research would be better classified as being part of the IB literature on culture and not informal institutions. The terms informal institutions and culture are distinct, even if they can overlap at times. Definitions of culture vary in the literature, but it is often defined as a broader term in IB that captures, quote unquote, the collective programming of the human mind that distinguishes the members of one human group from those of another. Culture, in this sense, is a system of collectively held values. That's Hofstede. It is the deeper level of basic assumptions and beliefs. Schein. Informal institutions, on the other hand, is a more narrow term that captures the actual unwritten rules and norms of behavior, which likely arise as a result of and in conjunction with the cultural framework, but also of formal structures in place in a given location. Because institutional and cultural framework arose largely independently from different disciplinary and ontological traditions, their underlying assumptions, boundary conditions, and logics are often incompatible. So we encourage them to be treated separately, unless, of course, we are developing a paper where we're really trying to bring them together. And then we really have to get to the assumptions, boundary conditions, logic. But that's not what most papers do. They just basically treat them as synonymously without doing all of that hard work of bringing them together first. The three main institutional traditions and the role of informal institutions in each. The three main institutional traditions, and this is outside of business, beyond our field, across disciplines, are rational choice institutionalism, which arose particularly in economics, institutional economics, organizational institutionalism, often called neo-institutionalism, and historical institutionalism, often called comparative institutionalism. The three traditions are based on different disciplinary and ontological foundations with distinct assumptions and boundary conditions. So it is critical to explain clearly which one a paper builds on. Often our research doesn't do that. It just talks about institutional theory and everything is the same, right? So we include a table in the special issue, in the editorial, which explains each of these, the definition of institutions and informal institutions from each perspective. We also talk about reconciliation efforts that have tried to bridge the gap between two or three of these. We talk about the elements of these, formal, informal, regulative, normative, cultural, cognitive, etc. I only have 10 minutes. I don't have time to go in depth, but as you can imagine, there is a lot of richness to this table. There was so much work that went into being able to summarize this into a single page. So I hope you have a chance to take a look at it and let me know if you have any questions. Summary of the special issue papers. So I'm very excited to present each of these papers. They are, each of them is different. It's looking at informal institutions from a different angle. What I love about the topic of informal institutions is that it is interdisciplinary by its very nature, right? So look at the main institutional traditions. Some of the papers draw from organizational institutionalism, some from rational choice institutionalism, some from historical institutionalism. They conceptualize institutions, informal institutions in different ways. For example, the first one here is looking at informal institutions, it's looking at superstition in Myanmar and looking at it from the point of view of informal institutions. Fascinating work. Family business legitimacy, community informal institutions. Two of the papers look at social trust, but from different disciplinary backgrounds. One is more of an international finance paper and one more of an international strategy paper. Guangxi, government informal institutions reducing environmental and behavioral uncertainty, public sentiment, historical informal institutional legacies. That paper is the only one that's really looking at the historical background and how informal institutions are something that can endure for generations. Really fascinating. Informal institutional effectiveness, convergence, and distance. One of the papers being presented today, most of the papers look at the effects of business, of informal institutions on business aspects, on international business, but the paper that Kristin is presenting actually looks at the effect of business on informal institutions. So I just want you to see the richness and the possibilities of things that we can study in informal institutions that we are only starting to scratch the surface here. Context, Myanmar, China, Denmark, one of them has looks at 83 countries, 64 countries, Korea. There's just so many backgrounds that are looked at. And again, there's so much more that we don't do in the special issue because we couldn't do everything. So based on that, areas for future research. There's limited work on informal institutions and IB in general. So any work on informal institutions is going to be welcome at this point. But remember, our field is interdisciplinary and this topic is interdisciplinary. So the IB field's interdisciplinary nature can be especially beneficial as informal institutions cross disciplinary boundaries. And IB researchers are trained to engage in frame shifting and looking at the world from the point of view of different disciplines. It's contextual. Its focus on context makes IB particularly well suited to studying the systemic intricacies of informal institutions across contextual settings and to advanced theory. It's cross-level. The IB field's cross-level nature can be particularly useful as institutions are typically conceptualized at the national or organizational field levels of analysis. But those are not the only levels at which institutions can exist. We go to much more depth in the editorial. IB theoretical frameworks. The study of informal institutions can be quite useful for advancing other theoretical frameworks used in IB. How do we connect it to each of the other frameworks? Think of resource-based view, knowledge-based view, any of the theoretical frameworks we use. How does it connect? How does it help us enrich it? Conceptualization and measurement. It is important to develop measures and indices of informal institutions that are squarely built on an institutional framework. IB and informal institutional change. Understanding how IB influences institutional change and vice versa. I could speak about this for hours, but obviously we have limited time. So let's jump to presentation 2, and then I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. So I'm going to stop sharing and we can go to presentation 2.
Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting us to present our paper in this webinar. Paper called Impact of Informal Institutions on the Prevalence, Strategy, and Performance of Family Firms, a meta-analysis, which is co-authored by Pascual Berrone, Luis Gomez Mejia, Percy Huygens, Tatiana Kostova, and Mark Fanese. I'm Patricio Duran. I'm Associate Professor of Management at the University of Richmond. And thank you so much for joining us in this presentation. So those who have followed closely the literature of family business, which is very, very important and huge literature, there are some general findings that we can see in this literature. The first one is that family business are the most common type of corporation worldwide. There are many papers suggesting that family business actually are very prevalent outside of the US and other Anglo-American countries, and the most typical organizational form that we can find in different places. Also, the family firms usually pursue a unique strategic behavior. They deviate from other firms that are not family controlled in terms of internationalization, innovation, risk-taking, etc. And finally, that also a very common narrative is that family business tend to overperform non-family counterparts in many societies. However, at the same time, we can find that in many places, family businesses are not the most prevalent actors, or the opposite. They are minor actors in the stock market and in the economic environment. Also, they tend to conform non-family business in many strategic behaviors. And at the same time, they underperform non-family businesses, or at least they have a similar performance indicators in terms of accounting or market performance measures. So the question that we wanted to address in this paper was whether there's a theoretically satisfactory explanation for these contradictions that we see in the literature and also that we see in reality. And we wanted to go beyond formal institutional explanations, which pretty much suggests that family business prevalent and strategy and performance is a product of the legal and regulatory institutions that are weak or the lack of institutional voice. So we ask how informal institutions can in some way complement this literature. And our research question was pretty straightforward, was how do national informal institutional environment in which family firms are embedded affect their prevalence, strategic choices, and financial performance. So we introduce in this paper the concept of family business legitimacy, which is theoretically rooted in the concept of legitimacy literature, which pretty much suggests that corporations in some contexts have higher degree of passive taking for grantedness and also enjoy some active social political endorsements. So based on these theoretical roots, we build this concept of family business legitimacy, which in fact reflects the degree to which a country environment is characterized by the set of social ordering systems, social relationships, and values that identify or recognize the family firm as the basic unit of economic production and kinship ties as the predominant conduit of social and economic exchange. So we also aim to measure this family business legitimacy across different societies, as you can see here in this slide, and also you can see the full data and indicators in the actual paper. So our family business legitimacy index is based on 20 items grouped into 5 formative dimensions, including the intergenerational survival orientation, continuity orientation, network-based relations, in-group solidarity, and patriarchal dominations that all together create an environment in which family businesses enjoy legitimacy by different constituents. Also, we explored this index, or we came up with a measurement of this index in 83 countries, both emerging and developed economies. And what is very interesting for the institutional literature is the fact that the index of family business legitimacy is orthogonal to formal institutions. And then we explain further how formal and informal actually interact on the behavior, prevalences, and performance of family business. So we found empirically through sophisticated meta-analysis techniques, we found that in weak family business legitimacy context, family businesses are in fact outnumbered by non-family counterparts. They are minor actors in those societies. Also, they tend to follow or they tend to conform non-family business in many strategic decisions, and they don't overperform or they just ordinary performance compared to a family business. However, in a strong family business context, family business are pretty prevalent. They pretty much dominate the local economic environment. They also pursue unique strategic behavior, pretty much they avoid risk-taking kind of behavior. And at the same time, their financial outperformance. So we contribute with these findings to the specific institutional embeddedness literature, in which we show to the literature that informal institutions complement instead of substituting for weak formal institutions, which is the current and prevalent prediction about why family business are more prevalent or behave differently compared to family business in many societies. So in other words, family firms emerges at the intersection of formal and informal system, with informal institutions, which is the one that we develop in this paper, can support or can constrain family-centric goals. For example, looking for increasing influence or control of the family over the firm, or the intentions of multi-generational family involvement in the firm, etc. This is pretty much based on how much the society give legitimacy or not to the family business as a unique organizational form. And finally, we also suggest that the scholar should consider informal institutions as a separate and independent influence on firm behavior. So to move forward and how we can get you more excited about informal institutions in the context of family business, I suggest scholars, and we suggest scholars to motivate your research context with the family business legitimacy. So for example, those scholars interested in designing international or competitive family business studies, we suggest to first consult the family business legitimacy measure and the country scores before selecting their sample and making theoretical predictions. From our paper, we show that in some contexts, family business don't differentiate much compared to other firms. So it would be really important for moving forward in the literature to understand very, very well how the context actually influence the behavior and performance of family business. And our index can help you to identify better and to motivate better why you are using a specific sample to address your research question concerning family business strategy and performance. Also, the approach that we use in this paper to identify and to measure family business legitimacy can also be used to develop more management-specific measures of informal institutions for other kind of organizations that also can be prevalent or can be absent in some societies. Like, for example, business groups, which is very prevalent in some societies, but not in others, professional service firms, and also state-owned enterprises. And finally, we encourage future research to conduct more novel empirical tests of the family business legitimacy measure in order to determine whether the set of indicators that we have in our measure could provide a possible specification of the index and offer a more fine-grained indicator that can help us, for us interested in understanding the differences in terms of behavior and strategy and performance of our business across country to better explain how informal institutions actually can predict the behavior of these very important and interesting firms worldwide. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and you have the time to see this paper.
Okay,
thank you so much, Patricio. Oh, thank you so much, Patricio. So let's go to the third paper. Kristin?
Yes, thank you, Patricio. Yeah, thank you so much, Patricio. Okay. So thank you so much for inviting me for this presentation today. I'm presenting the paper on the impact of multinational enterprises and community informal institutions in rural poverty. This is, of course, a collaborative work which I wrote together with Elizabeth Moore from Northeastern University, Minbaeva from the University of Cape Town, and Jonathan Doe, and is appearing in that special issue Louis was talking about. My presentation is going to be predominantly on that informal institutional aspect today. So I'm not going to talk about the entire paper, but really emphasize this informal institutional aspect. So the overall objective of the paper was for us to identify the local communities in rural areas, in predominantly developing economies, and these rural communities run these local areas and agricultural areas, basically, by using their community informal institutions. And we wanted to identify how these communities and the community informal institutions they use is behaving if multinational enterprises are entering the countries, are seeking natural resources and taking over this arable land from these communities, acquiring this land from governments usually. And then what is happening to these communities, what is happening to these informal institutions, which the community used for many, many centuries to take advantage of that arable land, usually for subsistence farming, for local trades with other communities in the rural area. So from a theoretical perspective, as Louis already outlined as well, we're using informal institutions from the new institutional economics perspective. So that would be basically the rational choice institutions Louis mentioned. And so we identify this institutional ecology in that rural area, and that institutional ecology consists basically of an equilibrium between formal institutions like the codified rules and regulations in the area, but also there's informal institutions, the common beliefs, traditions, customs, which is used by these communities. And so we are kind of focusing on more location-specific institutional ecologies and this kind of equilibrium between these formal and informal institutions. And we combine these arguments by also considering the community informal institutions, which is according to a Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom's research on these traditions and norms and customs, which these rural communities have used for centuries to manage and sustainably manage predominantly natural resources. So we combine basically these arguments of formal institutions in the country, but then also these rural community informal institutions, and argue that we need to look at these location-specific institutional ecologies, and specifically also on these communities and how the communities used this land prior to the multinational enterprise taking over. And so we're talking about this commitment of community members to the community, to these values and traditions. And the community strength of, or the strength of a community is basically based on the commitment each community member has, the tie each community has to those traditions, to those values in those local and rural areas. So what does this mean exactly? So we have, prior to the multinational enterprises taking over the land, we have informal institutions which were used predominantly in this rural area. On those traditions, norms, value systems is related to basically what kind of crop to use in a local area, to what time, how do they use the crop, who's getting access to the final produce, how are they trading the final produce. So these communities use this land basically for peasant smallholder farming. Now, the multinational enterprise is coming in and provides also more formal institutional environment. So there's this trade-off between formal and informal institutional environment. So we have now codified rules and regulations which are coming in, which are taking over basically that land. And those multinational enterprises use that land for agricultural production, for agro-farming, for an international environment, predominantly to harvest flowers and tulips and so forth. And so we have this change of the institutional ecology from a predominantly informal institutional environment prior to the multinational enterprise taking over the land to a more formalized institutional environment. after the multinational enterprise takes over. And so there's this change of weakening the communities and strengthening basically these formal institutions. And that is our hypothesis number one. So we wanted to identify how this land acquisitions for natural resource seeking purposes increases or weakens communities. Now, of course, as I already mentioned, there's community strength. That means these communities are strongly interconnected and tight-knit, and this strength is also reducing the poverty of basically the rural environment and the rural community. And so they're working together to sustain basically the farming activities. And so stronger communities in this area really provide and also or reduce the rural poverty and provide more prosperous environments. And so when we're taking both of these together, so the mediator of community strength as well, and this argument of multinational enterprise weaken communities, we find basically, we argue that this community strength could mediate the impact of these multinational enterprises taking over the land and then leading basically to rural poverty. So we have this mediation effect here. So a focus on, of course, because this is a session on informal institution, it's important to identify how we measure these informal institutions. And as I already mentioned, we argue that these informal institutions are a representation of the tight-knit and interdependency of the community on each other, so the community strength. And so we wanted to identify this community strength indicator in more specifically and identify really how do the communities or individuals contribute to this strength of the community. So what we're using is the World Bank Development Indicator has this really nice measure which identifies how important one individual worker in a population is to support the family. And so for us, the family is also an extension of the community. So how important is that worker in contributing to the community, which is an indicator of how tight-knit, how strong basically this community is. So in order to, though, avoid not measuring unemployment in a sense, we created our own measure by regressing this percentage of workers in a population who solely support the family or community against the percentage of unemployment. So we wanted to make sure that we're not just measuring unemployment, so really making sure that we identifying this community tightness or the interdependency. And so that was kind of the way we used the informal institutions and the way we measured that informal institutions. And as you can see, I mean, we have, of course, dependent variables and independent variables and mediating variables. I don't want to go into too much detail, but I just want to briefly outline that other measure we're using, which is also fairly novel in international business, is that identification of acquisition of land, so that multinational enterprises take over that land, and we use the land matrix initiative to identify where in the area, in which rural community land was acquired, how the community reacted to this acquisition of land. So we have this really neat measure, the independent variable as well. And because we're using a mediation model, we use a four-step mediation, which identifies basically first the impact of on rural poverty, basically of land acquisition or rural poverty. Then the second step is the community strength impact on rural poverty, and then of course the last step is the combination of the mediation effect of the two. And so what we're finding is really all of our hypotheses are supported, which was awesome. And we're finding that we really have, we identified that natural resource seeking FDI has a negative impact on this community and basically enhances the rural poverty. And the mechanism we specifically looked at was the impact on the communities and how the community informal institutions are impacted by that activity. So going forward, and what we think we should do and need further is basically identify and broaden the view on what informal institutions are, and maybe look outside of classic AIB arguments as well, look at the rural environment, maybe go to the community level, use the community informal institutional argument as we did as well. Of course, it doesn't apply to all contexts, but there is possible further activities here what can be used. We also think that we need to look more at the M&E activity as well, how they do and what their implications is. And of course, this has implications for policy as well, and for governments and how governments should react in activities and the selling of land and arable land. Okay, and that's it. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, I know these papers well, so I think they're really fascinating. I hope you found them to be so as well. We want this to pique your interest, right? We want you to go and read these papers and the other papers from the special issue. And most importantly, just to get excited with the topic of informal institutions, if you aren't already, and go do more research on informal institutions and international business. So hopefully we've accomplished that. I tried to answer some of the questions on the chat, but now Dana is going to lead the Q&A. So please post questions to the Q&A part, not to the chat. I mean, in the chat, if it's a quick question, we can answer it there. But if it's something you want us to discuss among the panelists, it's better if you put in the Q&A.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Excellent. And thank you very much for presenting the whole special issue for us. Yes, so a couple of clarification questions our speakers answered in the chat. I am going to pick up on one that actually was posed there by Ruth Aguilera, and let me just kind of try to summarize and restate it. I am going to address or ask all the panelists here to comment on that. So what Ruth wrote in the chat, she wrote very interesting work in relation to co-editors and authors. Now comes a question. Is there a blurry set of institutions that are hard to label, you know, and kind of distinguish between formal and informal? And how do you handle instructions that have evolved from informal to formal and vice versa? I guess that's a very interesting question. And Ruth, in your question, you're actually touching on a couple of points that our presenters here kind of discuss. For example, the difference between formal and informal, the boundary between formal and informal, the dynamics, right? So as for instance, both Patricia and Kristin indicated, there's certain dynamic relations between formal and informal, or as you put, Kristin, equilibrium between formal and informal institutions. So I'm going to go like in the order of presentations. So first starting with you, Luis, what are your thoughts and comments? Actually, Ruth also referred to some other work that I know you used in your editorial. So let's start and get with you first.
Thank you, Dana. So Ruth, great question. I sent you a quick response in the chat. I think it's a great question because it depends on how we're defining informal institutions and formal institutions. Just as I responded to somebody else about culture, it depends on how we're defining everything. I think one of the first things we need to do is be very, very clear where our definitions, right? The formal institutions are the written rules, right? Laws, regulations. The informal ones are the unwritten ones. There will be some things that are a gray area, that are not as clear. And I don't know any work that really disentangles that clearly enough, right? So I'm glad you're working on that, and I'm happy to have a discussion with you about it because I think it's very important. But I think that starting with being very clear on what we mean by each of these, and how, because informal institutions had received so little attention, is the first step. But the next one, I agree, is really seeing where this gray area is. I wish I had a more specific answer because that's exactly what we're all trying to figure out.
Oh, let's hear from other presenters. Patricia, what's your take on it?
Yes, I agree with Luis about this. I think it's a significant question for us. It was also very important to identify how we define informal institutions was the first challenge that we have in our paper. And also we wanted to show that informal institutions actually complement the formal institutions. So we also have the challenge to define very well what we mean formal institutions. Luckily, in terms of the family literature, institutional literature has been really clear about what is formal, but less clear about what's informal. And that is our contribution in our paper. So it's defining, offering a concept of what we believe, or what we propose as informal institutions based on the reality of this specific organization and firm, and measure it based on the information data that we can find in the literature overall. But I agree with Luis. I think that is a very interesting question that people interested in this topic could follow and try to see some boundaries in which in some societies, especially in the emerging economies, the boundaries are blurred compared to other places.
Indeed, very much depends on the context. So I'm glad that you picked up on that, Patricio. Kristin, would you like to add something on the issue of definitions?
Yeah, I would like to add and maybe emphasize again what we try to do, at least a little bit, is go one step above just measuring or identifying that a specific informal institution turns formal, but we looked at this rural area. So we looked geographically at location and identified an equilibrium there, and then try to identify maybe is there a movement between a predominantly informal environment moving into something more formalized. And so it's kind of regional, it's area specific. So it's not that we looked at one specific tradition, which might have been informal, and then moved or became formalized, which would be really interesting to identify as well, to see if there's like something informal, which we've done for many years traditionally, becomes formalized. But in our case, we really looked at this area, maybe like a geography, a location, which allowed us then to at least hypothesize that there is as well this movement from an informal dominated environment to a more formal environment, and after basically the multinational enterprise came in and took over that arable land. So it maybe helps a little bit, but of course not answers entirely the question, but maybe that was an attempt for us to kind of use that equilibrium argument, movement from one to the other, so from an informal to a more formalized environment.
Absolutely. I could say that also, I guess, you know, then you indicated that dynamics go in one direction. I would assume that, you know, once we understand the dynamics better, we may potentially identify the causal mechanisms that could also explain the reverse, so to say, quote unquote, dynamics. And I personally, as working in this area as well, I'll totally support Patricia's argument that we have to take, you know, this dynamism out of established, you could say, context, and maybe bringing them in the context where the boundaries are so blurred, right? So we can actually answer some of the questions that been bugging us for quite a while. Among those, you know, that endurance of informal institutions that Luis actually pointed out at. I'm going to go to the next question, and that question is for you, Patricia. Patricia, it's a question that Shenlong Chen asked in the QA. Have you compared which type of institution, formal or informal, has more influence on decision making?
Yeah, what we did in the paper was control by formal institutions, and then to analyze the effect of informal institutions on our variables. And pretty much in terms of prevalence, we saw that when formal institutions are present and informal institutions are in the model, formal institutions are lost significance. So it's pretty much informal institutions who have a significant effect on the prevalence of family firms. In terms of the performance, we see that when the same story here, when informal institutions are present and is controlled by formal institutions lose also predictive power, and informal institutions actually have significant effect on our dependent variables. So this is just initial, let's say this is not conclusive findings. I think it's important to go to do more research Our intention wasn't to interact formal and informal institutions. In fact, we ran some tests, as you can find in the appendixes in our paper. However, our intention was pretty much to suggest that when formal institutions are present, also informal institutions actually have some effect on our dependent variables of interest.
Right. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to go to the next question, or rather a bundle of questions. And these are questions for you, Luis. I think it's also a reaction to what you said during the presentation that, that is a culture part of informal institutions part of culture. And I know in your previous answers, you said that, well, it depends on the definition and where you're starting point. But nevertheless, our participants are still very curious about it. And specifically, for example, Alan writes in a Q&A, like, can you give an example on how culture differs from informal institutions? And then actually also a little bit later, Volahan is also talk about, could you clarify what you mean that there are differences in formal institutions? I also seen a comment in the chat from Dina. Would you say that the culture is subset of informal institutions? So I think there is there are actually quite a few questions regarding this. So I'll start with you, Luis. What's your take on that? What did you mean when you said that?
Thank you, Dana. So this was one of the hardest things to write through the rounds of review, discussion with the editors, discussions with Alan, with all the editors. I mean, it was, and with the co-editors, co-authors. So I encourage you to read what we wrote, because that's going to explain it more clearly than I could here in just a few minutes. And I also encourage you to read other authors that we cite, especially Helmke and Levitsky, 2004. They say explicitly, they talk about 4 different things that informal institutions are not: organizations, culture, and other things, and why, right? But they tell you these are the reasons why culture and informal institutions are different. Please read those. They will explain it very clearly. But as what we explain is that, first of all, the definitions of culture vary in the literature. So depending on how you're defining culture is how close it is to informal institutions, right? But informal institutions are a very narrow and specific term, right? They're the unwritten rules of the game, right? Unwritten norms, right? Culture tends to be a broader term that captures the, like, as I said, as I quoted Hofstede, the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes the members of one group from another, a system of collectively held values, Hofstede tells us, the deeper level of assumptions, right? Informal institutions are much more narrow, right? So for example, we also say this in the paper, whereas culture is often captured with broad-based values dimensions, such as uncertainty avoidance, embeddedness, assertiveness, depending on if it's Hofstede, Schwartz, House. Informal institutions specifically refer to the shared unwritten norms or social expectations in a society, organization, or other social grouping. So even if we have a broader definition of culture that does encompass some of this, the way it's measured usually does not encompass this. More importantly, because institutional and cultural frameworks arose largely independently from different disciplinary and ontological traditions, culture started with anthropology, right? I took an entire course on culture from Kendall Roth in South Carolina in my PhD. Institutions arose, economics, political science, sociology, different fields, right? But very different views within institutional frameworks and even within cultural frameworks, right? Because there's also 2 different clear cultural traditions with very different views. So they arose independently from different disciplinary and ontological traditions. So their underlying assumptions, boundary conditions, logics are often incompatible. So even within work on culture, there's 2 main traditions, right? There's the values-based framework, which is the one that has been used in international business mostly. Hofstede, Bond, House, Rockich, all of these people. We cite all of these in the editorial. And the cognitions-based framework, DiMaggio, Miller, Sewell, and so many other amazing scholars that I think their perception is even richer, but it really has not received that much attention because it's harder to measure, right? It's harder to conceptualize and really wrap your mind around it. So basically what I'm saying is you have traditions, separate traditions with very different foundations. If you want to combine them, you have to start from the foundations. Okay, so I'm going to relax this assumption, this boundary condition in this one, and in this one, and this is how I'm going to make them compatible, right? And this is why these two things are basically working together. I mean, so much work that has been done on culture assumes that culture doesn't change, for example, right? We say that it does, but I mean, we're still using measures from the 70s that were developed in the 70s and papers today, culture, right? Informal institutions makes it clear. I mean, there's so much work just on institutional change and how does it happen? On the table, you see all the different ways that institutional change can happen. Is it equilibrium where it doesn't change, or is it punctuated equilibrium where there's change and then no change for a while and then more change, right? Is it evolution where it changes slowly over time, or is it punctuated evolution where there's big change and then it doesn't change for a while or just a little bit? How does it change, right? That is so important in our studies of informal institutions, and in culture, it really hasn't received that much attention. That is just one example, right? There is so much. We really delve a lot more deeply into that. And even in that editorial, we couldn't do enough because that's not what the editorial is on or the special issue is on, right? We just wanted to do enough to make it clear why these are different. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I think, as you said also in your opening, we're starting to scratch the surface. I'm gonna send this question to Kristin right now, but add to that something what Stacy also wrote in Q&A, just to catch up on Stacy's question. Either the strengths of the community, the informal practices used by the communities to manage their land, or is it interdependence between families and the communities? And again, as Stacy also writes in the Q&A, I'm just asking that because I'm trying to tease, she said, apart the distinction between culture and formal institutions. So I guess we can take from Louise ended and take it for Kristin. What's your take on it?
Yeah, of course. And thanks, Stacey, for the comment. So for us, the difference between the community or the culture and community strength, or what we use informal institutions, is predominantly that we identifying both of your arguments. Basically, we identifying both that we have the informal practice, which is in order to use the rural land, and in combination with the dependency or interdependency on families. So it's a combination of, so we can't distinguish one or the other. So for us, and that's why it's maybe also different to culture in the sense as what you perceive culture, what culture is. So it is an understanding of what to use the land for and how to use the land and how to communicate with other members of the community, but then also how to contribute to that community, how to engage with the community. And so I think there is this distinction here than having maybe, or just considering it as a culture. So there's a variety of different aspects which incorporated community strength, which we argue is basically our, that's what we characterizes basically the community informal institutions, is that community strength. And the way we measure this as well is then related to that as well. So one of the questions was related to how we measure this community strength. And it is basically how important individual members are to the community. So, and that importance is signified in how much do they contribute to the community. So implicitly in the way they behave, in the way they work and use the land, how important are they? How much do they contribute to the community, and how engaged are they with the community? And that is for us basically that identifying factor of an informal or community informal institution. So the importance, the tightness of the community, strength of the community is based on really how important is every individual member of the community to the community. And the more they engage, the more they contribute to the community, the more they also, or the stronger is the community then? So that's what we identify as the strength, either way, weak or strong communities. And so for us, there is a difference because it's not a community culture. It's the combination of a variety of different informal aspects, traditions and values, which are ingrained in those individuals, and that connects to not just how to use the land, what to do with the crops at the end, who is getting access to what kind of crops and how much, and what is the role of each individual community member in the overall community. How much do they contribute and what do they contribute? Some individuals only contribute by working on the fields, others are providing nutrition for the farmers who work on the fields. So there is a distinction between each individual person of what their contribution to the community is. And that is what we kind of identified and hoped also measured through basically identifying this individual person's contribution to the community, to the family, and how the importance of that individual person was. I'm not sure, Dana, if I answered the question.
No,
I think I did.
Yes, but we're getting there. We're having a conversation. And actually, if I may also to offer a comment that Ruth Aguilera left in the Q&A, basically saying that in a sense, she actually wrote, I love the idea of the informal institutions evolving into formal, as Kristin's et al. Paper totally shows. So thank you for that. Now, what I would like you to comment, Patricio, is also first and foremost, of course, the question that I posed to Luis and Kristin, but also perhaps if we can move, given that we can distinction, assuming that, right, that accepting that we could distinction between culture and informal institutions. So how do we approach empirically, the question of measuring the impact or evolvement or presence of informal institutions, and particularly if Anjong is actually asking, I'm wondering if we need to empirically test an informal institution, if we conceptualize it from scratch or from a different perspective or against an existing concept. So how do we get from definitions from measurements? So, and of course, please do comment on other issues that other panelists also touched upon. Trisha.
Yes, please let me first comment of the current discussion. I would say that, yeah, discussion is very interesting. We can spend a lot of time discussing this. It's intellectually, motivating. But I suggest you to also follow the literature of political ideology, which is also very interesting because it's right in the middle between formal and informal institutions. We cannot say exactly whether political ideology, for example, as informal institutions, if define informal institutions in terms of culture, tradition, but still something that has been present over the years. So for some particular society, is something that is not written. It's pretty much something, it's philosophical thinking about how the society should be, how the values of the society should be, and also how the regulations and formal institutions should be developed in order to come up with the expected society that every ideology have in mind. So we are working actually in many papers of political ideology, and we struggle with the question of how we define ideologies based on this binary definition of institutions, right? Formal versus informal. And that is something that probably we have neglected or overlooked because political science hasn't been much incorporated in our discussion of institutions in AIB. Regarding the measurement of institutions, what we follow, and that was also a challenge in our paper, what we did is a formative index measure in which we come up with the literature and we read the literature of how different scholars have identified the role of informal institutions on family businesses. And when we come up with some proxies to measure that from current measurements of informal institutions from, let's say, GLOVE Project or the World Value Survey and others. And then following this literature, we come up with the dimensions and we follow the techniques of formative index to come up with different weights and come up with the final index. This is the approach that we follow in a paper. For those interested in this approach, which has been less explored in the strategy literature, you can see our paper, and also you can check the appendix in which we show step by step what we did to come up with the index. I believe this was already it's a big effort to do this. You have to come up from the literature to understand, the concept and define different dimensions, but it's doable. And then you can also perform many analyses and tests to see whether actually what we are trying to measure is actually measuring, but the technique is clear. And it's one way that we found out to come up with our measurement. And we believe that the same approach can be used to other kind of organizations like business groups and state-owned enterprises to capture in better shape how we can identify those specific informal aspects that drives the behavior of particular organizations.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. All right, I would like to take on three of you to the next question. And again, I'm collapsing several questions together in here. And these questions are on that interfaces between formal and informal institutions. So for example, Alan is asking, can you please explain how formal institutions can influence informal ones? And I guess the other way around. There's two parts of one question from Louisa, who actually talks about, in fact, issues around studying this institutional void, but also I'm kind of trying to put formal and informal institutions, I guess, in one equation in here. So now that we are more or less debated the informal institution culture interface, so let's go to the next interface: informal institutions, formal institution. So what are your thoughts on these issues? Luis, I know that you actually touched upon these dynamics in your editorial. Maybe we can start with you.
So you want me to talk about the dynamics
between formal and informal, how you see that, particularly the question that, for instance, Alan is asking, could you please explain how formal institutions can influence informal ones? And I guess the other way around.
Yes, so take a look at the table in the editorial where we break it down into the three traditions and then the efforts to reconcile them. The three traditions, just as we're saying that you can't just take literature on culture and informal institutions and dump them together and use them synonymously without first explaining why their foundations are consistent. The same thing happens with the three traditions. Often we just use the term informal institutions, or we just say institutional theory, and we refer to North and Scott and Granovetter, and we just draw from all of these without considering that perhaps they're not talking about the exact same thing, and their foundations are different. Their understanding of how institutional change happens, how formal institutions influence informal institutions and vice versa, right? All of this has been developed in different disciplines and different disciplinary traditions, very different understanding, logic. So it's important to really see where you're drawing from, and if you're going to draw from more than one, to really explain why. And so how do formal institutions influence informal institutions? It's such a broad question. It really depends on what we're talking about, right? Some people, there's work by Williamson, I believe, that we cite as well, that looks at how informal institutions are the foundation for formal institutions, and then they are the foundation for cultural cognitions, right? And that would be a way of combining the formal and informal literature with the cultural literature on cognition.
Right. It will be one of the ways, right? Because then also we have, many other views. And actually, I just post the link to a paper. It's not from JIPS, but it's actually some of our work where we go into the discussion around these different views that Luis is talking about. But Kristin, you in your answer earlier, you already touched upon that. Is there anything else you would like to add, particularly with the answer to, for example, Louisa? So formal and informal dynamics. How does it exactly happening? Is there, how do we we can see that the potential equilibrium between formal and formal institutions. Anything?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things which need to be considered as well when we're talking about this equilibrium, because I mean, we assume that formal and informal institutions have generally, there's a change process no matter what. We have, I mean, times are changing, we have more policies coming in, which means there are more formal rules, more formal regulations. We have specifically in emerging markets and developing economies, a general movement of formalization, predominantly like the rules and regulations become very, I mean, we talk a lot about institutional voids and not existing formal institutions or not really implemented formal institutions. And it goes along with the discussion about really having and formalizing and maybe becoming more formalized over a period of time, aligned maybe with development levels as well, that we can see that there's maybe a movement from an equilibrium which predominantly was informal and moved then maybe into a more formalized activity, which means that the institutional voids become less and less prominent. And so I think that is a discussion which we also need to consider, and which we do in the paper as well, and which needs to be acknowledged, that the ecology is changing no matter what. So we need to kind of acknowledge this. But the question is also, who is forcing the change? Is it a natural gradual change over a period of time, or is it an exogenous shock change? Is there some, like in our case, a multinational enterprise coming in and forcing the change? So there is also this debate of how is that change happening, and is there like a forced shift towards one or the other? And as you said, Dana, as well, maybe there's a reverse effect as well. If something formalized becomes informal. And so that discussion, I don't think we have really tackled yet. I think there is quite a lot of possibility here as well to maybe look at an informal institution and how it has formalized over a period of time, or is there maybe another possibility of identifying regional or country? I mean, we look at the region, but we predominantly look at countries as well, and we consider an entire institutional environment based on a country. And so that is also an argument which we need to consider as well. So how is that institution, where is the institution, what is it covering? And I guess that depends also on what institutional theory field you're looking at, because Louis was mentioning that there's a variety, and we know Ruth has talked about this as well, at different institutional strands. So we look at more the economic perspective. Patricio looked more at the social legitimacy arguments. And so I guess it becomes a more broader discussion, and going into that argument, what strand are we actually looking at, and where could that change be, and how is there like a possibility of change from one informal to formal? So I don't know, Dana, there's so much we can do.
Absolutely. Luis, did you want to comment upon that quickly?
Yes, I think Kristin hit on some really important points. I mean, basically, as she said, there's just so much that we could look at. But think, for example, of a country which has which changes governments, and they completely impose a different formal institutional framework, right? Which is at odds with the informal institutional framework that people are happy with, or that people are used to. And we see how the conflict that this can lead to, and how difficult it's going to be to change those informal institutions. Formal institutions, in some ways, you could say, are easier to change, right? Because, I mean, you can change the laws. Obviously, they're not easy to change, but they're easier to change, right? You can just write a different set of rules, right? Of written rules. But the informal ones, many times they're taken for granted. Many times we don't even consider them. And so people see them as the way things are. We don't even consider them as humanly devised constraints. We consider them the way human beings are. That's part of why I tell my students that international business education is critical, and studying abroad, living abroad, because they start to see that many of the rules that they take for granted in their home country are not the only ways of thinking, of seeing reality, right? And so anyway, again, a lot we could see here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see both in the Q&A as well as in the chat, quite a few participants pointed out to the greater need for contextualization, taking out from the to the emerging market, developing country context. I'm just happy that we are, as a field, moving away from that. I would say personally, and as a researcher who's been working with this for quite some time, as well as a person who is coming from background where informal institutions matters a lot. So I'm just happy that we are moving from that simplistic understanding when formal institutions become more effective, informal institutions disappear, or at least their influence over behavior of individuals in the firm weakens. And I think this is exactly the view that has been, very predominant earlier, I guess, in AIB, particularly when we work with the transitional economies. But if you look at what we have today, 3 decades or more after the fall of Berlin Wall, most of transitional economies developed formal institutions, but informal institutions remain present and powerful. And many of you living in the developed economies, where very strong formal institutions can still observe informal institutions, having an influence over individual and firms, such as, for example, Grand École in France or Jan Toulon in Denmark. So there is definitely, as a field, as Louis is saying, it's not just acknowledging that informal institutions existing, but also unfolding the complexity of us. No, when formal institutions become effective, there will definitely that change that Kristin was and Patricia was also talking about, but informal institutions will not disappear, right? And of course, on the mechanisms, I also noticed that Saad was asking a question about the role of network. Unfortunately, we wouldn't have time to go into that detail, but there is I'll post the link of a paper that actually talks about the role of network and channeling change and continuity to informal institutions. Patricia, now to you. There is a question with regards to issues related to sorry, I just lost it. That's related of the methodologies, right? So what are the methodologies now that you know much more about the field, you've done meta-analysis, what are the methodologies that we should be using? And actually, I'm going back to the opening of today's webinar when Luis was talking about the importance of interdisciplinarity. So perhaps also touching upon these issues in terms of both benefits and challenges. So any comments on that, please?
Well, regarding the methodology, pretty much I'm an empirical person. So we more get used to the standard methodology to capture these measures. As I mentioned before, the formative index was a way that we could solve the challenge of measuring informal institutions. That could be one. Others are suggesting qualitative studies, which is also, I think, is really relevant. There are many, many beautiful qualitative studies in terms of informal institutions. And I think that is a very important first approach to better theoretical understanding on how, for example, the question that we're discussing here, how institutions evolve, how we can define some institutions, and how institutions actually interact or affect others. So building on the discussion that we had before, which is also related to methodology, I think the important question is to first understand whether formal is an antecedent of informal, or informal is an antecedent of formal. So what is the causality that we can find here? Or both institutions actually are in the same level of analysis. We can see that in the same level, of predicting some effect. The Williamson paper that Luis mentioned before, I think is really relevant to understand this, because it pretty much suggests that informal institutions actually affect formal institutions. It's an antecedent of formal institutions, but also there are some reverse causality in which you can find that formal institutions then also reinforce informal ones. We can see that in many examples in our daily life, like for example, this idea of regulations about food, for example, regulations about smoking, regulations about health, things that actually began first as a change of values, and then change of in regulations, and then change of values as well. So this is reinforcing all the time. That is really hard to capture with empirical analysis, rational empirical analysis. That requires qualitative and historical analysis to study how this happened over time. Also, the second question that is open as we can discuss here in this webinar is whether institutions complement or substitute each other. For example, the family business literature, the story was the narrative was that family business would disappear once formal institutions are more developed in many economies. And we haven't seen that at all, right? Family business are becoming stronger and more important actors, especially in the globalization stage that we're living today, in which local competitors more embedded in the society are becoming more competitive and enjoy more competitive advantage compared to other like multinationals or firms that are not socially embedded in the country and the society. So that's not happening. So probably the thesis of substitute is becoming less relevant, and the thesis of complementary is something that we should observe better, also maybe empirically and also theoretically, right? So as a summary, we have so many questions than the answers, and of course empirics would be one of the challenge to target and to address these questions, and we have to we need to find novel ways to measure this.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for putting it concisely. Well, you know what? The chat is on fire, and there's so many interesting references being exchanged, many forthcoming paper, many comments. So please have a look and perhaps also download some of those references if you still have time. We don't have, unfortunately, more time this morning or afternoon, wherever you are. I would like to thank Luis, Kristin, and Patricio for indeed, giving us a great appetizer, right? So again, as Luis said, the purpose of this webinar is to create the interest, start the conversation. All papers are included in special issue are available online, ready for download. Please contact authors directly if you'd like to continue the conversation. From my side, as I just want to quote Luis again, definitely starting to scratch the surface and finding already now so many interesting questions and interesting issues to discover. So thank you very much for that. I would like to pass to Klaus Meyer, my co-organizer, to talk about where we're going from here in AIB webinar series.
So thank you very much, Dana. Thank you, all the speakers. Very fascinating discussion on very challenging theoretical constructs. And I mean, the most interesting questions are sort of the interplay between different types of institutions, however we conceptualize them. And we make a very important point that we need to really be clear about the definition, because there's often not a consensus. But also how they interact dynamically over time. So, and I think those themes are relevant to a lot of fields of applications. In the chat, we had several people asking about where we can find the recordings of this webinar. And I think because there were quite challenging theoretical constructs, many of you may want to listen to some of the presentations again. You find them on YouTube. Now, I can't promise you when exactly this new one will be online, but I've just shared the screenshot from the YouTube website to find the past webinars. And it's quite a valuable resource by now in terms of what PhD students should know about our field. Right? So if you have PhD students working in this field, I would definitely recommend have a look and listen to some of those webinars that we've done over the last 2 years. Now, what are we planning next? We have 2 webinars that are in preparation, and I'm trying to share that now. One is going to be on the Belt and Road Initiative. That's also based on a special issue. JT Lee will be co-hosting with me, and speakers will be Arifan Ashe, Artemis Chung, and someone probably from the University of Leeds, who's author team for that other paper. And then I'll be also working on something on public health, the interface between businesses, both transmitting diseases on the one side, but also contributing to solving public health issues, but and thus actually links very close to the topic that we have today, how businesses contribute to resolving or possibly making worse public health situations in host countries has a lot to do with the interplay between business and the formal and informal institutions in that country. And then I'm talking to some people about something related to risk. We have an increasingly disruptive global environment where how companies manage risk is quite challenged. So that's the topic. So I think those next three topics indirectly will all draw on today's webinar, because today's webinar was really about the theoretical conceptualization about formal and informal institutions. The topics that I've just presented to you that we are currently working on our work seminars for October, November, apply those to specific questions and hopefully generalize important policy lessons from that. So thank you again, everyone. And thereby I end the formal webinar for today. Bye-bye.
Thank you.